ओम अज्ञानं तिमिरन्दस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्यमनोविष्टं स्थापितमेन भूतले स्वं रूपं कदा मह्यं ददाति सर्वदान्तिकं वन्देऽहं श्रीगुरुं श्रीयुतपदकमलं श्रीगुरुवैष्णवं च श्रीरूपं सागरजातं सहगन्धगुणात्मकं तं सजीवं साधुवेदं साधुभूतं परिजनसहितं कृष्णचैतन्यदेवं श्रीराधाकृष्णप्रदान सहगणललिता श्रीविशाखवितं च नमो विष्णुपदाय कृष्णपृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमति भक्तिवेदांत स्वामी नामिने नमस्ते सरस्वती देवी गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पासदेश तारिणे हे कृष्ण करुणा सिंधु दीन बंधु जगतपते गोपेश गोपेकांत राधाकांत नमस्तुते तप्त कांचन गौरांगी श्री राधे वृंदावनेश्वरी वृषभनुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरि प्रिये वंचाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिंधु एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवसदि गौर भक्तवृंद। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। जगद्गुरु श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय। Starting with the new book, The Science of Self-Realization by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, Jagadu Srila Prabhupada की जय।
तो प्रभुपाद का स्मॉल बुक तो हम कंप्लीट कर लिए हैं ऑलमोस्ट सारी। अगर एक दो कोई हमारी लिस्ट में रह गया होगा तो बात अलग है। तो आज ये मिड साइज बुक्स शुरू हो रही प्रभुपाद की।
जय। तो प्रभु जी यहाँ से स्टार्ट करें फॉरवर्ड से?
हाँ, फॉरवर्ड से ही शुरू करते हैं।
यस प्रभु जी, प्लीज।
Okay, so the name of this book is Science of Self-Realization. Forward. From the very start, I knew that His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada was the most extraordinary person I had ever met. The first meeting occurred in the summer of 1966 in New York City. A friend had invited me to hear a lecture by an old Indian Swami on Lower Manhattan's Bowery. Overwhelmed with curiosity about a Swami lecturing on Skid Road, I went there and felt my way up a pitch black staircase. A bell-like rhythmic sound got louder and clearer as I climbed higher. Finally, I reached the fourth floor and opened the door, and there he was.
Yes, Dashapta Prabhu.
Yes, Prabhuji. About 55 away from where I stood, 50 feet away from where I stood at the other end of a long dark room, he sat on a small dais, his face and saffron robes radiant under a small light. He was elderly, perhaps 60 or so, I thought, and he sat cross-legged in an erect, stately posture. His head was shaven, and his powerful face and reddish, horn-rimmed glasses gave him the look of a monk who had spent most of his life absorbed in study. His eyes were closed, and he softly chanted a simple Sanskrit prayer while chanting a hand drum. The small audience joined in an interval in call and response fashion. A few played hand cymbals, which accounted for the bell-like sounds I had heard. Vaccinated, I sat down quietly at the back, tried to participate in the chanting, and waited. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhu ji. Swati Mata ji. माता जी आपकी वॉइस बहुत लो है, बहुत ज्यादा लो है।
अब ठीक है?
हाँ जी माता जी, बिल्कुल।
After a few moments, the Swami began lecturing in English, apparently from a huge Sanskrit volume that lay open before him. Occasionally, he would quote from the book, but more often from memory. The sound of the language was beautiful, and he followed each passage with meticulously detailed explanations.
Anushka Mataji.
Hare Krishna. He sounded like a scholar, his vocabulary intricately laced with philosophical terms and phrases. Elegant hand gestures and animated facial expressions added considerable impact to his delivery. The subject matter was the most weighty I had ever encountered. I am not this body, I am not an Indian, you are not Americans, we are all spirit souls.
After the lecture, someone gave me a pamphlet printed in India. A photo showed the Swami handing 3 of his books to Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri. The caption quoted Mr. Shastri as saying that all Indian government libraries should order the books. His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada is doing great work. The Prime Minister said in another small tact, and his books are significant contributions to the salvation of mankind. I purchased copies of the books, which I learned the Swami had brought over from India. After reading the jacket flap, the small pamphlet, and various other literature, I began to realize that I had just met one of India's most respected spiritual leaders. Yes, his guest Ashwini Prabhuji.
Sorry, Mambutpada, but I could not understand why a gentleman of such distinction was residing and lecturing in the Bowery, of all the places. He was certainly well educated and by all appearances born of an aristocratic Indian family. Why was he living in such poverty? What in the world had brought him here? One afternoon, several days later, I stopped in to visit him and find out.
His grace the Shaptar Prabhuji.
Yes, Guruji. To my surprise, Srila Prabhupada, as I later came to call him, was not too busy to talk with me. In fact, it seemed that he was prepared to talk all day. He was warm and friendly and explained that he had accepted the renounced order of life in India in 1959 and that he was not allowed to carry on earn money for his personal needs. He had completed his studies at the University of Calcutta many years ago and had raised a family. And then he had left his eldest son in charge of family and business affairs, as the age-old Vedic culture prescribes. After accepting the renounced order, he had arranged a free passage or an Indian freighter, Sindhia Steamship Company, Jaldavid. Through an old family friend in September 1965, he had sailed from Bombay to Boston, armed with only $7 worth of rupees, a trunk of books, and a few clothes. His spiritual master, his divine grace Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur, had entrusted him with delivering India's Vedic teaching to the English-speaking world. And this was why at age 69 he had come to America. He told me he wanted to teach Americans about Indian music, cooking, languages, and various other arts. I was mildly amazed.
Okay, Swati
I
Mataji.
saw that I saw that Srila Prabhupada slept on a small mattress and that his clothes hung on lines at the back of the room, where they were drying in the summer afternoon heat. He washed them himself and cooked his own food on an ingenious utensil he had fashioned with his own hands in India. In this 4-layer apparatus, he cooked 4 preparations at once, stacked all around him, and his ancient cooking portable typewriter in another section of the room was seemingly endless manuscripts. He spent almost all of his waking hours, about 20 in 24, I learned, typing the sequels to the 3 volumes I had purchased. It was a projected 60-volume set called the Srimad Bhagavatam, and virtually it was the encyclopedia of spiritual life. I wished him luck with the I wished him luck with the publishing, and he invited me back of Sanskrit classes on Saturdays and for his evening lectures on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I accepted, thanked him, and left, marveling at his incredible determination.
Anushka Mataji.
A few weeks later, it was July 1966. I had the privilege of helping Srila Prabhupada relocate in a somewhat more respectable neighborhood on 2nd Avenue. Some friends and I pitched in and rented a ground floor storefront and a second floor apartment to the rear of the little courtyard in the same building. The lectures and chanting continued, and within 2 weeks, a rapidly growing congregation was provided for the storefront by this name, a temple, and the apartment. By now, Srila Prabhupada was instructing his followers to print and distribute leaflets, and the owner of the record company had invited him to record an LP of the Hare Krishna chant. He did, and it was a huge success. In his new location, he was teaching chanting, Vedic philosophy, music, japa meditation, fine art, and cooking. At first, he cooked. He always taught by example. The results were the most wonderful vegetarian meals I had ever experienced. Srila Prabhupada would even serve everything out himself. The meals usually consisted of a rice preparation, a vegetable dish, chapatis, tortilla like whole wheat patties, and dal, a zestfully spiced mung bean or a split pea soup. The spicing, the cooking medium, ghee or clarified butter, the close attention paid to the cooking temperature and other details all combined to produce taste treats totally unknown to me. Others' opinions of the food called prasad, the Lord's mercy, agreed emphatically with mine. A Peace Corps worker who was also a Chinese language scholar, was learning from Srila Prabhupada how to paint in a classical Indian style. I was startled at the high quality of his first canvases.
Okay. In philosophical debate and logic, Srila Prabhupada was undefeatable and indefat- indefatigable. He would interrupt his translating work for discussion that would last up to 8 hours. Sometimes 7 or 8 people jammed into small, immaculately clean room where he worked, ate, and slept on a 2-inch thick foam cushion. Srila Prabhupada constantly emphasized and exemplified what he called plain living and high thinking. He stressed that spiritual life was a science provable through reason and logic, not a matter of mere sentiment to blind faith. He began a monthly magazine in the autumn of 1966. The New York Times published a favorable picture story about him and his followers. Shortly thereafter, television crews came out and did a feature news story. Yes.
Srila Prabhupada was an exciting person to know, whether it was out of my desire for the personal benefits of yoga and chanting or just out of raw fascination. I knew I wanted to follow his progress every step of the way. His plans for expansion were daring and unpredictable, except for the fact that they always seemed to succeed gloriously. He was 70ish and a stranger to America, and he had arrived with practically nothing. Yet now, within a few months, he had single-handedly started a movement that was mind-boggling.
One August morning at the Second Avenue Storefront Temple, Srila Prabhupada told us, "Today is the Lord Krishna appearance day. We would observe a 24-hour fast and stay inside the temple." That evening, some visitors from India happened along. One of them, practically in tears, described his unbounded rapture at finding this little piece of authentic India on the other side of the world. Never in his wildest dream could he have imagined such a thing. He offered Srila Prabhupada eloquent praise and deep thanks, left a donation and bowed at his feet. Everyone was deeply moved. Later, Srila Prabhupada conversed with the gentleman in Hindi, and since what he was saying was unintelligible to me, I was able to observe how his every expression and gesture communicated to the very core of the human soul.
Later that year, while in San Francisco, I sent Srila Prabhupada his first airline ticket and he flew out from New York. A sizable group of us greeted him at the terminal by chanting the Hare Krishna mantra. Then we drove him to the eastern edge of Golden Gate Park to a newly rented apartment and a storefront temple, an arrangement very similar to that in New York. We had established a pattern. Srila Prabhupada was ecstatic.
A few weeks later, the first mridanga, a long clay drum with a playing head on each end, arrived in San Francisco from India. When I went up to Srila Prabhupada's apartment and informed him, his eyes opened wide, and in excited voice, he told me to go down quickly and open the crate. I took the elevator, got down on the ground floor, and was walking toward the front door when Srila Prabhupada appeared. So eager was he to see the mridanga that he had taken the stairway and had beaten the elevator. He asked us to open the crate. He tore off a piece of the saffron cloth he was wearing and leaving only the playing heads exposed. He wrapped the drum with a cloth. Then he said, this must never come off. And he began giving detailed instructions on how to play and care for the instrument.
Also in San Francisco in 1967, Srila Prabhupada inaugurated the Rath Yatra, the festival of the chariots, one of the several festivals that, thanks to him, people all over the world now observe. Rath Yatra has taken place in India's Jagannath Puri each year for 2000 years, and by 1975, the festival had become so popular with San Franciscans that the mayor issued a formal proclamation, Rath Yatra Day in San Francisco. Yeah. Yes, Suji.
By late 1966, Srila Prabhupada had begun accepting disciples. He was quick to point out to everyone that they should think of him not as good God but as God's servant. And he criticized self-styled gurus who let their disciples worship them as God. These gods are very cheap, he used to say. One day after someone had asked, "Are you God?" Srila Prabhupada replied, "No, I'm not God. I'm a servant of God." Then he reflected a moment and went on, "Actually, I'm not a servant of God. I'm trying to be a servant of God. A servant of God is no ordinary thing."
In the mid 17th, Srila Prabhupada translating and publishing intensified dramatically. Scholars all over the world showered favorable reviews on his books. And practically all the universities and colleges in America accepted them as standard texts. Altogether, he produced some 80 books, which his disciples have translated into 25 languages and distributed to the tune of 55 million copies. He established 108 temples worldwide, and he has some 10,000 initiated disciples and a congregational following in the millions. Srila Prabhupada was writing and translating up to the last days of his 81 years stay on earth.
Srila Prabhupada was not just another Oriental scholar, guru, mystic, yoga teacher, or meditation instructor. He was the embodiment of a whole culture, and he implanted that culture in the West. To me and many others, he was first and foremost someone who truly cared, who completely sacrificed his own comfort to work for the good of others. He had no private life but lived only for others. He taught spiritual science, philosophy, common sense, the arts, languages, the Vedic way of life, hygiene, nutrition, medicine, etiquette, family living, farming, social organization, schooling, economics, and many more things to many people. To me, he was a master, a father, and my dearmost friend.
I am deeply indebted to Srila Prabhupada, and it is a debt I shall never be able to repay. But I can at least show some gratitude by joining with his followers in fulfilling his innermost desire, publishing and distributing his books.
Yes, Mataji, complete कर दीजिए.
I shall never die, Srila Prabhupada once said. I shall live forever in my books. He passed away from this world on November 14, 1977, but surely he will live forever. Michael Grant Mukundadas.
Introduction. Who is Srila Prabhupada? People often ask, and it is always a hard question to answer. For Srila Prabhupada always eclipsed conventional designations. At various times, people have called him a scholar, a philosopher, a cultural ambassador, a prolific author, a religious leader, a spiritual teacher, a social critic, and a holy man. In truth, he was all these things and more. Certainly, no one could ever have confused with him the modern entrepreneurial gurus and who came to the West with slickly packaged, watered down version of Eastern spirituality to satisfy our urge for instant well-being and exploit our well-documented spiritual need. Srila Prabhupada was rather a true holy man, sadhu, of deep intellectual and spiritual activity. He had deep concern and compassion for society, which to such a large degree lacks real spiritual dimension. Yes.
For the enlightenment of human society, Srila Prabhupada produced some 80 volumes of translations and summary studies of India's great spiritual classics, and his work has seen print both in English and in many other foreign languages. Also in 1944, Srila Prabhupada single-handedly launched a magazine called Back to Godhead, which today has a monthly circulation of more than 500,000 copies in English alone. Nearly all the interviews, lectures, essays, and letters chosen for the science of self-realization first appeared in Back to Godhead.
In these pages, Srila Prabhupada presents the same message that the great sage Vyasadeva recorded thousands of years ago. The message of ancient India's Vedic literature, as we shall see, he quotes freely and often from the Bhagavad Gita, the Srimad Bhagavatam, and other classic Vedic texts. He transmits in modern English the same timeless knowledge that other great self-realized teachers have spoken for millennia. Knowledge that opens up the secrets of the self within us, nature and the universe, and the supreme self within and without. Srila Prabhupada speaks with startling clarity and a kind of convincing, simple eloquence and proves just how relevant the science of self-realization is to our modern world and our own lives.
Among the 36 selections chosen for this special book, we hear Srila Prabhupada's moving poem upon his arrival in America, his exchange with a noted cardiologist on soul research, his revelations to London Broadcasting Company on reincarnation, his telling remarks to the London Times on real and false gurus, his dialogue with a German Benedictine monk on Krishna and Christ, his insights on superconsciousness and the law of karma, his conversation with a leading Russian scholar on his spiritual communism, and his intimate talk with his disciples on the sham of modern science.
Read the selections in order if you like, or start with the ones that first catch your interest. The glossary at the back will explain unfamiliar words and names. The signs of self realization will challenge you and bring your inspiration and enlightenment. The publishers.
Plate 2. Plate 2. Reincarnation of the soul. The first fact that we need to understand on the path of spiritual enlightenment is graphically shown here. As the child grows, he becomes a boy. The boy becomes a young man. The young man becomes an adult. The adult becomes an old man. Throughout all this time, although his body is changing from a child to an old man, the person still feels that he has the same identity, the same self. But what is this self? And what happens to it at the time of death? But what is this self? And what happens to it at the time of death? Lord Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita 2.13 and 2.20. Within the body is the soul, the self. And just as the soul passes from one's infant body to his youthful body, and from his youthful body to his aged body, so the same soul passes into another body at death. For the soul, there is never birth nor death, nor having once been Does he ever cease to be? He is unborn, eternal, never existent, undying, and primeval. He does not perish when the body perishes. Later in the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna compares the process of changing bodies to discarding an old set of clothes and donning a new set. But the soul's new set of clothes, his new body, need not to be human. There are 84 lakh species, including beasts and human beings. By the law of karma, what kind of body person gets in the next life depends on the acts he performs and the desire he cultivates in this next life. Prabhupada, I don't know, PP 2535. Should we continue, Prabhuji? Yes, Ashwin Prabhuji. It's
So
7:27.
we can complete this. Yeah, we can complete this plate 3 and then we'll stop.
Okay, Prabhuji. Yes, please.
Whether boss or laborer, master or servant, president or prisoner, everyone in this world is under the tight control of the three modes of material nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance. When in turn are controlled by Lord Krishna, which are in turn are controlled by Lord Krishna. It is only out of illusion that people imagine themselves to be free. After all, is anyone free to prevent his own death? As Krishna explains in Bhagavad Gita 3.27, the bewildered spirit soul, under the influence of the three modes of material nature, thinks himself to be the doer of activities that are actually carried out by nature.
Yes, so we can stop here and start with the learnings and the realizations. Yes. Prabhuji, you want to say something? Who's there, Ashwini Prabhuji? You want to share something?
Yeah, तो इसमें एक पॉइंट तो ये मैं समझाऊं कि प्रभुपाद भी जब स्टार्टिंग में प्रीचिंग किए थे सेकंड एवेन्यू न्यूयॉर्क में, तो बहुत क्लासेस भी स्टार्टिंग बहुत फिलोसफिकल, मतलब अट्रैक्शन पॉइंट जो था वो ऐसा था जैसे म्यूजिक है या कुकिंग है, ताकि लोग आए कनेक्ट हों, और उसके बाद प्रभुपाद ने उनको फिलोसफी से कनेक्ट किया था। तो यूजुअली जैसे हम लोग भी इस्कॉन में कई बार किसी प्रीचर के लिए बोलते हैं कि अरे ये सब इस्कॉन में क्या शुरू हो गया है, प्रभुपाद ने तो ये बताया यू आर नॉट द बॉडी सोल। तो हम लोगों को भी समझना चाहिए प्रभुपाद जो हम खुद ही पढ़ रहे हैं आज की बुक में कि प्रभुपाद ने भी इन सब चीज़ों को यूज़ किया था अल्टीमेटली भगवान कृष्ण कॉन्शियस देने के लिए। डायरेक्टली तो कोई भी भक्त नहीं बना है, वेरी फ्यू दो जो बहुत ही इंटेलेक्चुअल थे पहले से। यूजुअली लोग पहले जनरल चीज़ें ही म्यूजिक कुकिंग से कनेक्ट हुए, फिर प्रभुपाद से एज अ पर्सन कनेक्ट हुए, एंड देन दे स्टार्टेड हियरिंग व्हाट प्रभुपाद वाज सेइंग। तो कई बार हम लोग नहीं समझ पाते हैं, और कई बार प्रीचर भी सिर्फ कुकिंग और म्यूजिक पे ही रह जाते हैं, तो वो भी गलत है। तो वो मेरा रियलाइजेशन है। दूसरा जो लास्ट में हम पढ़े थ्री मोड्स ऑफ मटेरियल नेचर के बारे में, तो ऐसा बताते हैं कि ये जो भगवान भगवद गीता बताए हैं 13 चैप्टर में कि ये जो पूरा टोटल मटेरियल मैनिफेस्टेशन है, दिस टोटल सब्सटेंस इज कॉल्ड महातत्व, और इस महातत्व को भगवान इम्प्रेग्नेट करते हैं सभी लिविंग एंटिटीज से। वैसे डेड मैटर है, बट जो लिविंग एंटिटीज हैं जितनी भी, इस टोटल सब्सटेंस को, नॉट ओनली लिविंग एंटिटीज पर वैसे भी मैटर ही है अगर देखा जाए मटेरियल मैनिफेस्टेशन, बट इसमें जान जो डालते हैं तो भगवान उसको मैनिफेस्ट करते हैं। और उसके बाद फिर इस नेचर में थ्री मोड्स ऑफ मटेरियल नेचर काम करते हैं, और उसके माध्यम से जीव इसमें घूमता रहता है। तो बताते हैं कि जैसे स्कॉर्पियन जो है वो राइस में अपने लेग्स देता है, मतलब वो क्या करता है कि राइस में ही अपने अंडे देगा और फिर उन अंडों से स्कॉर्पियन पैदा होंगे, तो ऐसा लगेगा कि राइस जो है वो पैदा कर रहा है स्कॉर्पियन। तो वैसे ये जो मटेरियल नेचर है ये एक्चुअली भगवान इम्प्रेग्नेट करते हैं, और मटेरियल नेचर से फिर लिविंग एंटिटीज एक के बाद आते रहते हैं। बट आउटसाइड से ऐसे देखने से लगता है कि मटेरियल नेचर से लिविंग एंटिटीज आ रहे हैं, बट एक्चुअली दिस मटेरियल नेचर हैज बीन टाइड अप विद थ्री मोड्स ऑफ मटेरियल नेचर, मोड्स ऑफ गुडनेस, पैशन एंड इग्नोरेंस, और फिर उसी के प्रभाव में जीव एक से एक योनियों में घूमता रहता है। बट एक्चुअली ओरिजिनली किसने इसको अगर बोले तो इस मैटर नेचर को गर्भवती किया है, बिकॉज दिस इज प्रकृति एंड कृष्णा इज आदि पुरुष, तो दैट इज कृष्णा। और इस नेचर का काम है थ्री मोड्स ऑफ मैटर में, नेचर थ्री मोड्स ऑफ में ऑफ नेचर में घुमाना जीव को, तो उसमें वो जीव उसमें घूमता रहता है उसके प्रभाव में। बट द वन हु ट्रांसेंडेड, then he enjoys all six opulences with Lord Krishna. This is my learning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Thank you so much. Yes. Let's get the Shabda. You want to share something? Prabhuji?
Yes, Prabhuji, sorry.
Yes, please.
या तो प्रोजी मुझे तो वो पॉइंट अच्छा लगा था जब मतलब हमने जो पढ़ा आज पूरा एक तरह से समरी था प्रभुपाद की लाइफ का, कि जो डिसाइपल है मुकुंद दास, तो उन्होंने पूरा बताया कि जस्ट एक समरी दिया कि कैसे प्रभुपाद जी बड़े मतलब कैसे प्रभुपाद जी बॉस्टन आए एंड देन फिर यहाँ पे प्रीचिंग उन्होंने स्टार्ट किया, और कैसे जैसे धीरे धीरे प्रभु जी बता रहे थे कि धीरे धीरे पहले प्रभुपाद जी ने कुकिंग वगैरह से मतलब लोगों को इंटरेस्ट लाया कुकिंग और प्रसादम में, फिर प्रसाद खिला के प्रभुपाद जी ने उन्हें फिलोसफी सिखाई, एंड धीरे धीरे फिर हमारे कम्युनिटी मतलब फिर हमारे मतलब मूवमेंट बढ़ा। तो एंड प्रभुपाद जी का मतलब मुझे सबसे अच्छा पार्ट वो लगा जब प्रभुपाद जी बहुत ज़्यादा एक्साइटेड थे मृदंगा के लिए, और जब सैन फ्रांसिस्को में फर्स्ट टाइम मृदंगा आया था तो उन्होंने एक्सीलेटर को भी फेल कर दिया था। सो दैट मोमेंट लाइक मतलब ऐसा लग रहा था कि प्रभुपाद जी बहुत ही ज़्यादा मतलब सर मतलब बहुत ही ज़्यादा एक्साइटेड थे उस मृदंगा के लिए, एंड मतलब और उसको मतलब उसको अच्छे से कपड़े में बांध के भी रखा, जो सैफरन कपड़े में प्रभुपाद जी ने तुरंत उसे पहनाया सैफरन कपड़ा, और लोग फिर बाकी अपने डिसाइपल्स को सिखाया कि कैसे इसकी केयर करनी है और कैसे इसको प्ले करना है ना। तो मतलब इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स के प्रति प्रभुपाद जी का इतना लगाव था, तो हम फिलोसफी और बाकी चीज़ें तो फिर हम बात ही नहीं कर सकते, तो मतलब यस मतलब यस प्रोजी दैट्स इट, दैट्स द पॉइंट है।
Thank you, Prabhuji. Swati Mataji, you want to share something?
हरे कृष्णा। मुझे मतलब जो हमेशा से आज भी पढ़ के या पहले भी लगता है कि हाउ सरेंडर श्रीला प्रभुपाद वाज फॉर हिज गुरु। तो मतलब अपने स्पिरिचुअल मास्टर के की इंस्ट्रक्शंस को उन्होंने कितना फॉलो किया कि इतनी इस उस एज में आके भी उन्होंने डिसाइड किया कि जब वो अमेरिका आए और इतनी स्ट्रगल्स के बाद भी, एंड ही वाज सो डिटरमिन्ड, जैसा कि इसमें बता भी रहे थे बुक में भी, एंड वो सबको अट्रैक्ट कर लेते थे। मतलब उनके जो फिलोसफिकल्स जो उनकी बातें होती थी उसके थ्रू भी, और जो उनका ऑरा था उससे भी वो सबको अट्रैक्ट कर लेते थे। तो वो चीज़ मुझे बहुत अच्छी लगती है। और कि कैसे मतलब मैंने एक सीरीज देखी थी वो प्रभुपाद की जो लाइफ के ऊपर उनकी बायोग्राफी है तो वो देख के भी और आज पढ़ के भी ये लगता है कि प्रभुपाद जी के डिसीजंस भी ऐसे होते थे ना कि मतलब इतने क्विक होते थे, प्लस वो सही भी निकलते थे। तो वो चीज़ें बहुत ही हम लोगों को अट्रैक्ट करने की है, मतलब कुछ उनकी लाइफ से भी बहुत सारी चीज़ें ऐसी हैं कि जो हमें सीखनी चाहिए। और वो मृदंगा वाला पॉइंट भी जो अभी दशावतार प्रभु जी ने शेयर किया, दैट वाज आल्सो वेरी इंप्रेसिव। या प्रभु जी।
Thank you. Thank you, Mataji. Anushka Mataji, you want to share something?
नहीं प्रभु जी।
Okay. Thank you. Yes, from my side, हाँ यही मेरे को मृदंगा वाला पॉइंट बहुत अच्छा लगा। और एक कितना स्ट्रगल किया प्रभुपाद ने, एंड ही वाज मतलब सो सिंपल एंड कॉन्फिडेंट एंड एंड मतलब भी भगवान पे बहुत ज़्यादा डिपेंड थे वो। उनके लाइफस्टाइल से पता चलता है कितना स्ट्रगल करने के बाद एक सन्यासी जो ज़्यादा पैसे कैरी नहीं कर सकता और यूएस में जाके एक शिप पे जाके दो हार्ट अटैक सर्वाइव करने के बाद, इतना स्ट्रगल करने के बाद और इतने मतलब पेशेंस और काम के साथ उन्होंने इतना बड़ा एम्पायर क्रिएट कर दिया। तो यस, ओनली प्रभुपाद कैन डू दैट। He was not ordinary. Yes, as many, as everyone used to say that he stayed always on transcendental platform. He was not from this world. So yes, achievements may, we should consider Prabhupada's achievement. We should remember those achievements in our mind. So to realize every time, whenever we are in Krishna, in this moment, we need to realize, we need to learn, we need to memorize the achievements of Prabhupada. So that would help us in, मतलब वो हमें इस मूवमेंट से और अच्छे तरीके से जोड़ेगा अगर हम प्रभुपाद के अचीवमेंट याद रखेंगे. Yes, that's all from my side. So anything anyone wants to share or add on?
Prabhuji, I just want to share one thing. I mean, I have shared pretty much everything. I really like when I think someone was reading about how Prabhupada was used to cook with old, like 4 meals at a time with one, and I was thinking, and down the line, we probably must have seen, but in next generation, right, when they will read all of this, they can't even imagine all of this. So it's it just seems, out of the world things. Whatever Prabhupada did at that time, it just seems, oh, was it really happen? Is it happen on the Earth planet, or is it something, some other planet?
Yes, exactly, Prabhu. Nice. Thank you, Prabhu. Anything anyone would go ahead? Okay, so we are good now. We can stop. Vanchakal patru bhascha kripa sindhu patitanam pavane beveshne gunamana Srila Prabhupada ki. Yeah. Thank you for joining everyone. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna.